Please welcome the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney.
Well, good morning, Summiteers. How great to be here. 8 times, no less. I consider it a big deal to be asked back even once, let alone this many opportunities to speak to you. And I think that's mostly, as has been indicated by Jeff and before him, Bill Armstrong and John Andrews, dear friends. That's because of the importance of the message, not the messenger. And I'm here to just very quickly go through a bunch of information that I think you really need to know. Some of it I'm sure you're aware of, especially if you've been here with me before, but some of it is fortunately new, because we do have a new president now engaging in what I call the war for the free world. Because you were here, you didn't probably have a chance to see him make a presentation today in commissioning the newest warship of the United States Navy, the USS Gerald Ford. God love him. America is coming back, but we're going to talk now about what it's up against, and that will be my privilege as we go through a quick PowerPoint presentation. It's going to go fast, so watch the replays if you don't catch all of it. One of my favorite quotes from my old boss, Ronald Reagan, about every generation facing an existential threat to freedom. In 1980, he ran on the platform of defeating the time's threat in that department, namely Soviet communism. He got a mandate to do it. He executed the strategy. I had a small role in helping him, and it was extraordinarily successful. And now we have a man who sees, I think clearly, a similar kind of existential threat in our time. Donald Trump has called it radical Islamic terrorism, as you know, and he has pledged in his inaugural address, no less, to eradicate it from the face of the earth. He needs, as did Reagan, a strategy for doing that, and what I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes is what I think is required for that purpose. Clarity is a theme that you're going to hear a lot about. Clarity about what we're up against. We've heard all kinds of euphemisms to this point. The guy on the left called it terrorism. The guy in the middle, uncharacteristically, called it violent extremism. Hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to it. And Donald Trump has used this phrase, radical Islamic terrorism. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what animates it, whatever you call it. And that is a doctrine that its adherents describe as Sharia. About 10% of this body of law has to do with pietistic practice. That's not the problem. The problem is the rest of it has to do with a totalitarian ideology that has this patina of religiosity, yes, but the rest of it is about political and military and legal instructions that every faithful Muslim is supposed to follow. Indeed, it is supposed to govern all aspects of their lives. Clarity about the fact that not all Muslims embrace Sharia, thank God, particularly in this country. One of my personal friends and favorites is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who has put together a reform manifesto that explicitly calls Sharia man-made law. Now that is what we would consider perhaps a good Muslim. For those who don't embrace his view and who instead embrace Sharia, that is called apostasy, and it can get you killed. Among those who believe that is the case are unfortunately the authorities of Islam. Again, not all Muslims, but a lot, and most especially those who call the shots in the faith. Clarity about Sharia's role in all of this is critical, because if we understand what it is, we have a chance of doing something about it. If we recognize it as a seditious program, we actually have laws for defeating it. On the other hand, if we continue to indulge in the idea that this is all a faith, and a faith by definition in our system, our Constitution, is protected, well, we're toast. because we cannot possibly allow this to continue to metastasize in our country without very, very deleterious effects. Clarity about what Sharia requires has to be another part of a plan for victory over jihad, because jihad is what is obliged of followers of Sharia. Everybody who gets that as their God-directed program understands they must participate in one way or another in jihad to advance the objective. So let me talk about jihad. We need clarity about what that entails too. The violent part of this is obvious and easy to get, is a problem, right? Everybody understands that. Unfortunately, it is very efficient, and that is why it is considered to be the preferred means of advancing Sharia's supremacist agenda. It can be performed by groups or by individuals, but don't buy anybody telling you that individuals are somehow lone wolves. They're disconnected. John Bolton spoke about this eloquently last night. In fact, they're simply performing what they can do if they don't happen to be with a group, or at least at the moment with a group. They may be inspired by a group, but what they are for sure inspired by is the doctrine of Sharia. And they are simply performing individual jihad, which is what they must do if nothing else is available. Another form of jihad, ladies and gentlemen, is what's known as hijra. That can be defined or translated in various ways. It is certainly immigration. You might think of it also as colonization, or even an invasion. And when you recognize that boats and boats and boats like these have been plying the Mediterranean to flood Europe with mostly military-age young men, unaccompanied at that, invasion is no stretch to define the term hijra. Demographic jihad is another way of thinking of it, and it's not just the invasion piece, it's just simply the outbreeding. And I'm going to come back to this theme again, I guess, supposedly, throughout the remarks, that it should be obvious to you all. If you think I'm exaggerating any of this, look no further than what is happening before our eyes to our friends, our allies in Europe. There's another form of jihad that is also almost always ignored, and that is material support for those who are engaging in one kind or another of this effort to impose Sharia on the rest of us. It's called zakat. Some think of it as tithing. That's really not a comparable term because it is obligatory. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam that you must make charitable contributions. Think of it as a tax, really. And by some estimates, as small an amount as an eighth, by other estimates, as much as a half of what every Sharia adherent, faithful Muslim must give in the way of zakat is to go to jihad, either directly to those who are waging it or to the families of those who die in the course of it or through other means. Sharia-compliant finance is another form of jihad. It is used not only to undermine our capitalist system, but also to promote and generate zakat. Oh, let me just mention this in passing. When President Obama spoke in Cairo, you may remember this, he packed the place in the spring of 2009 with Muslim Brotherhood operatives. And he spoke about his commitment to facilitate, to overcome obstacles to Muslims in America being able to make zakat. My friend, and I'm sure a much admired man by all of you, Andy McCarthy, has pointed out, as a former federal prosecutor, actually the only impediment to zakat in the United States is the prohibition on material support for terrorism. What was he thinking? A good question. Then there's these guys. As Craig mentioned, I think this is really the crux of what we need to be focused on at the moment. They too are engaged in jihad, make no mistake about it. They will engage in the violent kind of it where they can. They are, after all, known as Hamas in the Palestinian context. That's their franchise there. But they have franchises all over the world, including one very active in this country. Did you know that? They operate when they don't perceive the opportunity for the success of violence through a stealthy form of jihad. They called it civilization jihad in this handy-dandy little document. Those of you who've been with me before know I think this is the most important single book on the subject of jihad, certainly in America, not because we had anything to do with it. In fact, we were never supposed to know about it. This document was written by one of the top Muslim Brotherhood operatives in the United States back in 1991 as a report back to the mothership in Egypt to tell them about how splendidly things were going with their civilization jihad in America, whose mission, ladies and gentlemen, as quoted in this text, which was introduced, by the way, into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history, with this notable passage as the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. And I quote, "Destroying Western civilization from within by their hands," meaning yours and mine, "and the hands of the believers, so that Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions." Unquote. I don't know about you. I don't think that's particularly friendly. And I think that would actually disqualify them from being the influential group that they have been in our government for now some time. Not just the Obama years, I'm sorry to say the Bush years as well. In part, promoting this narrative, ladies and gentlemen. Again, we need clarity about what the Muslim Brotherhood is. They would have us believe that there's some line that defines the problem. On one side of it is the enemy, and they are the so-called violent extremists. You may remember that that's what Barack Obama called them. Huh, how about that? Then there's all these other people on the right side of the line, and they are the Muslims. The Muslims naturally eschew violence because they're practicing a religion of peace, or so they would have you believe. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood fits comfortably on that side of this artificially configured dividing line. Now, I did want to just mention in passing that the Muslim Brotherhood has a theory about who those violent extremists are that we do indeed need to worry about. Do you have a guess? It's us. It's conservatives, it's Tea Party activists, it's returning veterans, it's gun owners. Does this sound like you? Indeed it does. And the idea is, don't look over here, folks, where the threat is. Look at there, where it's assuredly not. I believe this is the kind of paradigm that Donald Trump needs to adopt and implement. I think he has his head around it, but let me just walk you through it. Instead of violence being the fault line, I think the difference really is best defined by Sharia adherence. And I don't know the exact proportions, but I suggest to you that in the Muslim world writ large, the population of Muslims who actually think Sharia is the path, is the way, I may not completely understand all of its particulars, but they think that's true, are on the side that I would call our implacable enemies. Not because I want that to be the case, but because that's what Sharia requires. It's their duty, remember, to engage in jihad, to accomplish Sharia's victory worldwide. Then on the other side of that Sharia adherent line are Muslims who don't want to live under Sharia. And it's understandable why they don't. It's pretty awful, especially if you happen to be female or homosexual or in some religious minority or really just about anybody. unless you're in kind of the elite. Well, they're potential friends on that side of the line. Well, ladies and gentlemen, would you hazard a guess which side of the fault line the Muslim Brotherhood is on if you define it this way? The wrong side. So let me just talk to you a little bit about why that's such a problem. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is actively trying to take us down, as is documented in this book. And by the way, we have some copies of it, I think, downstairs, and I'll be signing them after this. This is a serious problem because the organization on the left that you probably have never heard of, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the largest multinational group in the world, other than the UN, and it largely runs the UN these days because it's got a lot of the petrodollars that we have insanely been shipping to these hostile folks. And they've partnered up because they are both, of course, in the Sharia supremacism business with the Muslim Brotherhood. And both of them have had as a concerted project trying to keep people like me from telling people like you what is going on here. Not an accident, comrade, that the Obama administration, during its time, with the help of this gentleman, Rashad Hussain, who the president, in announcing his appointment to be his envoy, not ours, his envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, would be very welcome there because he is a hafiz of the Quran. Now, that might have been lost on most of us. It was not lost on the OIC because a hafiz of the Quran, as some of you may know, has actually memorized the whole Quran. Which, again, is kind of a clue that he's into it. Which is a problem, because that really means he's playing for the other team, not ours. He is a Sharia supremacist. And his support, and that of the Obama administration, for this international norm known as the Human Rights, the Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, was supposed to impose worldwide a prohibition on speeches like this because it offends Rashad Hussain and other Sharia supremacists. Now, there's this natty little problem of the First Amendment in this country, of course, which is supposed to allow me to have these kinds of opportunities, and thank God it's practiced by this organization and the summit. But listen, folks, don't take it for granted. Had Hillary Clinton won, she was all about this. In fact, she actually said in one of the confabs that flowed from the adoption of this UN Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, that she was going to use old-fashioned techniques of shaming and peer pressure to silence people like us. And that was the best of it. There's right now legislation working its way through the Congress to try to make all this really into hate speech, which gets to be sticky for the First Amendment. So keep your eye on this, folks. Let me just conclude by telling you a little bit about what I considered to be one of the real high points of Donald Trump's campaign. On the 15th of August in Youngstown, Ohio, he laid out a plan for victory over jihad. And I won't go through all of the particulars of it, but you get it. He was clear about the nature of the enemy, radical Islam. He talked about Sharia as the ideology that is animating it. He talked about the need for a strategy to defeat that ideology, much as Reagan did back in his day with the previous totalitarian ideology that sought our destruction, namely Soviet communism. He said very importantly that he was going to try to keep out of the country people who don't share our values. That was the genesis of the immigration pause. It needs to be implemented faithfully, as you know. And thank goodness it looks as though the Supreme Court might actually recognize the president's authority to do just that. And finally, and very importantly, he talked about countering the networks that are radicalizing in our communities. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Muslim Brotherhood. They are building the mosques. They are generating the front groups. In fact, it's very interesting if you do look this up. By the way, if you don't want to buy one, you can still look at it for free at our website, securefreedom.org. And there's a very helpful little guide to the players in this playbook. 29 of them marked down here, but again, this is 1991. There are many, many, many more now, 25, 26 years on. But they've been busily doing this, ladies and gentlemen, under our noses, radicalizing in our communities. You know, it's not a surprise, really, when you see those so-called lone wolves who aren't engaged in terrorism, heaven forfend, until it turns out they actually were. But they also almost always happen to be associated with a mosque. Have you noticed that? Typically, those are jihadist mosques, which have been built in many cases by the Saudis, and which are controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the guys slip the leash and get into that violent jihad while they're supposed to just be doing the stealthy kind. But either way, it's a problem, and Donald Trump put his finger on what needs to be done about it. So what does that mean? Well, so far, I think the single most important thing he's done, other than try to get this immigration pause past bad judges, has been to say in Saudi Arabia, to the faces of 50 assembled leaders of the Muslim world, the vast majority of whom are Sharia supremacists, or at least run countries that are all about Sharia and Sharia supremacism, most of them. And what did he say? You remember this. He said repeatedly and dramatically, drive out the extremists. Of course, he would have had to vacate the room, but that aside, it was an important marker laid down. And it raises the question, why hasn't more been done about this plan for victory over jihad in the ways he laid out in Youngstown, Ohio, in the 6 months he's been in office, apart from this speech? Well, John Bolton alluded to it yesterday. I don't know if you can make out the cast of characters in this little visual aid. That's more or less his national security team. And the truth of the matter is, most of them don't agree with Donald Trump on what the problem is. All of those things that I've suggested we need clarity about, they don't have the clarity about. As just one example, you may know this, on his first full staff meeting of the National Security Council, after being designated as the President's National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster said, "I don't agree with the use of the term radical Islamic terrorism." That's a tip-off. Might be a problem, since that's what the President says we're up against and wants to counter. These are some other examples. The fact that the President doesn't think Iran is in compliance with this terrible deal. His staff does, most of them. The President doesn't think that Qatar is on our side. His staff, most of them, think it is. I think the President is getting it that Turkey is actually now taking over the leadership role of the Muslim Brotherhood worldwide. In fact, they're pursuing a new caliphate out of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's increasingly dictatorial and theocratic regime. That's a problem. We can't consider them an ally, and I think most of his national security team thinks we must. And finally, most of his national security team doesn't want the Brotherhood designated as what it is, which is a terrorist organization. I think the President knows better, and I'm with John Bolton. I hope John Bolton is with the President, actually, but I'm hopeful that he will get his hands around this national security personnel problem. It is critical. Lastly, I'm just going to give you the points on what you can do to help, and I'm going to blow through this very quickly. Clarity on all of these points that I've just discussed with you, the nature of jihad, the forms that it takes, the people who are pursuing it, what their end state is, the dangers that it represents. And then just watch this quickly. We know we're up against Sharia supremacism. Find out more about it, what you can do to help, what you personally can do to help stop it including helping people, frankly, like me, immodestly, but also joining us in doing what you can in these regards. Educate your family, your friends, your neighbors, your business associates. Encourage your elected representatives, for crying out loud. At least ask them if they've ever read this. It ought to be a starting point. Demand that the media deal with this. Craig Silverman is a great guy, but there aren't enough of him. Make sure you're getting in front of all of them with your insistence that this be done. Don't let your children be propagandized, folks. And exercise your freedom of speech, because, as Ronald Reagan said, if you don't, that last little bit, you will exercise it in private with your children and your grandchildren, telling them what it was like to live in the United States when men were free. You're not here because you want to do that, are you? I don't think so. I'm not. I hope to be back next year, and you will be too, but with more accomplished on this front. Thank you all very much.